Hi again, folks. Thanks for being with us here at Defense of the Faith Ministries. You've just seen a real brief video clip of the structure that we're working on here. I'm now in the garage, soon to be within the next couple of months, hopefully, God willing, a Christian Apologetics Training Center where Jesus Christ will be glorified by what is taught from the Bible to the glory of His Father. And we're coming along fairly well. You can see behind me in this presentation a couple of windows that we put in and some of the insulation that we're using to put in before we drywall. So thanks for being with us. And today's session, I want to do something that I haven't done for quite a long time. And it's a presentation on Halloween. Now this is the first week in October. So Halloween is quickly approaching us, and it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are actually stores. There's one in our local city here of Aberdeen, Washington. Used to be an Ace Hardware before it went out of business. Now the whole entire store is devoted to Halloween City. That's the name of the store. And they come in normally about August of every year, and they're there for 3 or 4 months, all the way through the Halloween season, devoted completely and totally toward Halloween. Well, we're going to take a look then at the history and origins of Halloween just to see whether or not, dear Christian, you and your family should participate in this celebration. So let's get right to it then. Halloween can be traced all the way back to the ancient religion of the Celtic people in Ireland. And the Celtic people were very simple. They were very superstitious, and they were very conscious of their spiritual world. So they had some really strange beliefs according to, what we would believe today. They had over 300 gods, and their way of achieving salvation, I guess, or to get to heaven, would be to try to help their gods fight off their enemies, and in many cases trying to be as clever or as astute and cunning as their many gods were. Well, they had they had a number of feasts and celebrations throughout the years. But they had 2 major ones, one of which was called Beltane, and that was held on May 1st. It was the beginning of summer for this people. And the other one was held on November 1st, at the beginning of winter. And the word actually is S-A-M-H-E-I-N, and you'd think it would be Samhain or Samhain, but it's actually Samhain. So we're going to pronounce it correctly and call it the way that it is, Samhain. Well, they had this one on November 1st, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Samhain and what was done and so forth, their religious beliefs. But one thing they believed was that on Samhain, November 1st, their physical world and the world of the spiritual was probably the closest at any time during the year. A razor-thin membrane, so to speak, sort of separated these 2 worlds. And the spirits of their dead families and loved ones and friends and even enemies could come back over this spiritual membrane during this particular November 1st, Samhain. And in many cases cause all sorts of consternation and scary situations with the living. So these zombie-like, ghost-like entities were free to pass back and forth on Samhain, on November 1st. Let's see what Celtic mythology, a major source of Celtic legends and so forth, has to say about this celebration, this festival, this feast of Samhain. It says this: during this interval, the normal order of the universe is suspended. The barriers between the natural and the supernatural are temporarily removed. The Cid lies open, and all divine beings and spirits of the dead move freely among men and interfere, sometimes violently, in their affairs. And this is taken from Celtic Mythology, page 127. Now, the Celtic priests were the ones who carried out these rituals in the open air, in fields and so forth, and they were called Druids, members of pagan orders in Britain, Ireland, and Gaul. And they generally performed these rituals by sacrificing crops and animals and sometimes even human beings on this particular festival day and night, Samhain. And it was done to placate their gods and to ensure that the sun would return at the end of a very long winter. And of course, it was done to frighten away the evil spirits that were going to be roaming the countryside very soon. Well, to the Celtics, the bonfire then represented the sun. And it was a very important tool in the Druids' toolbox, in the Druids' arsenal, to fight against these enemies, I should say. Now, the term bonfire comes actually from two different words, bone fire. And we can see what it's referring to here, the bones of animals that were used to sacrifice, as well as the bones of human beings who, upon occasion, were also sacrificed on this particular festival. Now, these blazes were set in the winter, beginning November 1st, and they were to actually go all the way through the winter. They never stopped. But on Samhain, then, only the Druids' fires, the bonfires, could be blazing away. The individual villagers, the householders, had to extinguish their fires, and then they had to pay a fee in order to start them up again. So we can see extortion was alive and well way back in this Celtic time period. Well, during Samhain, then, these fires would be lit, and they would burn all the way through winter, and sacrifices would continue to be made. And about 1600, they did away mostly with human sacrifices, and from that point, if they were going to do something like that, they would burn effigies instead. Well, let's see then how Christianity sort of blended in with these pagan occultic celebrations and rituals. And when I'm talking about Christianity, of course, I do not mean Christianity in the biblical sense. I am referring to the Roman Catholic Church when I speak of the term Christianity. Of course, if you had attended our series on the Roman Catholic Church, you would see that Roman Catholicism is not Christianity by any stretch of the imagination. But for simplicity's sake, I will use the term Christianity, and when I do so, I refer specifically to the Roman Catholic Church and its traditions and so forth. Well, when the Roman Catholic Church, Christianity, spread to parts of Europe, instead of trying to abolish these pagan customs and these occult practices, they sanitized it with a sort of sanitary version of Roman Catholicism. And since that time, actually Halloween, Samhain, has been a confusing mixture then of traditions and practices of the occult and the pagan society of the Celts, mixed in with some sanitized Christian traditions and activities. By AD 43, Rome had conquered most of the Celtic territories, and during their rule, the Roman festivals were combined with many of the Celtic festivals, including Samhain. Now, the Romans observed a holiday called Feralia, and this was intended to give rest and peace to the departed souls and so forth, and participants could make sacrifices to the dead and make oblations to them and so forth. Another day the Romans celebrated was to honor Pomona, and I don't mean the city of Pomona in California. Not much to honor there, probably. I do mean the Roman goddess of fruit and trees. So we see the symbol of Pomona was actually the apple. And we were able to connect then this bobbing for apples, and it's also called ducking and duking. This kind of tradition that's been popular with Halloween for all these centuries to this particular origin here of the celebration of Pomona, the Roman goddess of trees and fruit. We'll talk more about the bobbing aspect then of Halloween in a couple of minutes when we get to that. Well, as the influence of Christianity spread into the Celtic lands in the 7th century, Pope Boniface IV introduced All Saints' Day. Now, this was a time when you could honor the saints and the martyrs and so forth of the Christian church, and it was done to try to replace this pagan festival of Samhain. But there was only one problem. The date that this All Saints' Day was set up was May 13th. Oh, wait a second, didn't we already say that Samhain was on November 1st? Yeah, we did. So he missed the mark. And then after a few more popes in 834, we had Pope Gregory, and Gregory III actually, and he moved All Saints' Day to November 1st. So at least you had All Saints' Day on the right day to be celebrated in place of, they hoped, in place of the paganistic Samhain celebration. Well, then October 31st became known as All Hallows' Eve, and November 1st would be known as All Saints' Day. Now, All Hallows' Eve, Hallows standing for saints. So now we see how that tradition got started. But sadly, though, many of the customs that had originated with Samhain, the paganistic, occultic customs that had originated with this particular festival and so forth, have persisted down through the centuries and have been a part of what today is celebrated actually as Halloween. In 1517, a Roman Catholic monk whose name you might recognize, Martin Luther, he chose November 1st as the day that he went public with a charge against the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy for abandoning some of the biblical traditions and faith of the church fathers over the centuries. This day became known as Reformation Day. Now, we've done a series on biblical prophecy where we showed you that these Protestant reformers, of whom Martin Luther was one, and Lutherans and Presbyterians and Methodists and so forth, they're like Rome's little daughters. So what they did was to rebel and move away from some of Rome's most egregious practices and traditions, man-made traditions. But they wouldn't go all the way. They refused to separate. So we can see the error of what they've done. Today, these Protestant mainline apostate denominations are actually going back to their mother church. The little Protestant daughters actually are going back to their mother in Rome. And that's the problem. Of course, the problem was they refused to separate completely from Roman Catholicism. Well, it's a celebration then, the Reformation Day, of restoring some of the biblical faith that had been in the centuries preceding and that had been sort of usurped by Roman Catholicism over the centuries. What about Halloween then? What about trick or treat? What about The Walking Dead? You know, my wife Gina and I, we've gotten away from cable TV, and that's a blessing. And so all we have now is high-speed internet, which we have to have for our business, our book dealer business, which supports our ministry. And so we've got our computer hooked up to our television, and what we see on TV is actually from the internet. The point is, we're talking about Walking Dead. We look for movies to try to watch, my wife and I do, and we have to go through hundreds of them on these various internet sites that run streaming movies. And I go through titles by the hundreds, and it's amazing how many zombie titles there are. Zombies versus vampires, zombie apocalypse, zombie island, zombie high school. I could go on ad infinitum, and most certainly ad nauseum. There are more zombie movies out there than you can shake a stick at. It's amazing the obsession that certainly American society, but perhaps all societies, seem to have for The Walking Dead. Now, we'll get to that in a minute to see perhaps how this fascination got started, where maybe the origin of this began. Well, some people trace the origin then of Trick or Treat to Samhain, and that was, of course, the night of supreme demonic jubilation. So during this particular, especially the night of Samhain, these spirits who were in the spiritual world could come into the physical world. And they're actually like ghosts or walking dead, if you will, the relatives of people who had died and so forth, family members. And they would try to wander around and try to find where they used to live. I guess they wanted to go back home. They didn't perhaps maybe much like where they were during most of the year. Well, you can see the consternation that was caused by this activity, these freely roaming entities, these walking zombies. The frightened, superstitious villagers didn't much care for this at all. So, what they did was to institute a policy of appeasement. Now, we can see how appeasing works in the geopolitical realm. All you need to do is take a look at our current government in Washington, D.C., and how this policy has failed, tremendously failed, and completely failed. But anyway, I digress. I shouldn't get off the topic here. Anyway, these frightened villagers would try to appease these Walking Dead entities, and what they would do, they didn't have much in the first place, but what they would do is take some of their fruit and some of their nuts and stuff and place it in a bowl and then stick it outside their front door and slam the door real fast and bolt and lock it and so forth, and hope that when these creatures came to their front door, they would be appeased by the meal that was waiting there for them. And perhaps hope also that maybe their neighbors weren't quite as prudent as they were, and maybe these entities would go next door and bother them and not bother the ones who had left out the fruit and nuts. Well, they felt if they didn't do this, of course, that these wandering zombie-like entities would maybe harm their livestock and certainly do physical damage to their property and so forth. The alternatives weren't particularly pleasant to this appeasing process. But there was one problem. If the souls of their loved ones and so forth could come back, cross over the spiritual membrane, if you will, on the night of Samhain, so could other things that perhaps weren't human and that perhaps weren't even as nice as their zombie-like departed loved ones were. So, the only thing that this superstitious people knew how to do besides trying to appease these zombie-like creatures was to go into stealth mode. Maybe drop below the radar, if you will. So what they used to do, they used to rub soot on their faces and put on masks. Now, these masks, they tried to make them as ugly looking as possible. And this was done in hopes of actually blending in with all these dead-like entities that were walking around the countryside. Today we have the origin, or that is the origin of today's custom in Halloween, of dressing up our kids and so forth as ogres and imps and demonic beings and creatures and so forth. It's pretty obvious that most of the costumes are not developed and made after the heroes of the Bible, but instead monsters and other demonic-looking creatures seem to rule and reign on this day of Halloween. Well, other people don't particularly care for that origin. What they'll do is they'll trace the origin of trick-or-treating back to European customs. And there was a custom called souling in Europe, where the beggars from the various villages would wander from house to house asking for these little soul cakes. And these little soul cakes were actually little cakes of bread shaped into squares that had currants baked into them. And they would go from household to household begging for these soul cakes. And so when the donors gave them these soul cakes, then these beggars would offer to say certain prayers for their departed loved ones and so forth, sort of to get them out of this limbo that the dead would go into when they passed away. That sort of reminds me of Roman Catholicism and purgatory and indulgences. But again, I digress, and I shouldn't do that. Well, in many parts of Britain and Ireland, this particular night became known as Mischief Night, where mostly the youth could wander around from village to village and get away with pranks and tricks and stuff like that, and not really have too much fear of being caught or having anything done to them as a result of these tricks and so forth, these pranks. I know that many years ago my dad used to tell me a story of how he and his older brother used to save up some of their explosives from the 4th of July, and then on Halloween they would go out and try to locate some outhouses and set off cherry bombs and so forth. That was great fun. I hope that they did a little advanced scouting and make sure that nobody was reposing in one of those outhouses when they set off the cherry bombs, but they probably did that, I imagine. But that's what they used to do when my dad was a boy. When I was a boy, now there was a custom called teepeeing. Now I myself personally, of course, never participated in this, but it would be taking a bunch of rolls of toilet paper and finding a classmate's home and so forth, and just spreading this toilet paper all over the cars parked in the driveway, the trees, the house, anything else they could unravel these toilet paper rolls on. Now, when it got moist and wet, oh my gosh, what a disaster. What a mess. Oh, I don't even want to think about it. Anyway, Halloween comes to America. How did that all happen? Well, traditional Halloween symbols, witches, black cats, pumpkins, candles, masks, parties, pranks, all these things started appearing in the United States about the middle of the 19th century, about the 1840s and 50s and subsequent decades and so forth. In 1848, you had the Great Irish Potato or Potato Famine. So you had in 1848 and subsequent years, millions of Irish immigrate to America. Now, when they came to America, they didn't leave their customs and traditions back in Ireland. They brought them with them. And they brought their celebration of Druidism with them also when they came to the United States. How about Mr. Jack-O-Lantern? What's his story? How does he fit into Halloween? Well, the Jack-O-Lantern is a festival for light. It's the light festival for Halloween, and it's the actual ancient symbol for the damned soul. Originally, the Irish would carve out these large turnips or beets and put a candle inside of them and make their faces just as ugly as they could to represent the souls of departed ones and perhaps even goblins that had been freed from the dead. But the problem was when they emigrated to America, the Irish and some Scottish and so forth, they didn't find massive amounts of turnips and beets growing and available for them. But what they did find were pumpkins. So I guess like the old story of Johnny Appleseed, maybe you had his brother Johnny Pumpkinseed out there having distributed a lot of pumpkin seeds in the decades prior to the 1850s, because you had a whole lot of pumpkins that the Irish found, and they used them as a pretty good alternative to their turnips and their beets and so forth. Well, of course, since that period, the jack-o'-lantern has been a very integral part of Halloween, and you see them everywhere, folks, everywhere. They put them out on their front doorsteps and so forth. Originally then, these jack-o'-lanterns were, as I said, carved out with faces that would rival the ugliest of those demonic creatures that were walking around on Samhain. So they did this and stuck a candle in them in order to perhaps scare away these demonic creatures that were out there wandering around on Samhain. And they would put them at strategic locations within their villages and put them in on their front porches and in front of their homes and so forth, hoping that because these carved out turnips and beets and then in America pumpkins would be so ugly that these demonic creatures would see them and flee in abject terror. I don't know how that worked out. Hopefully it worked out well for them. Anyway, bats, owls, other nocturnal creatures have always been a part of the Halloween celebration and so forth, and they were originally feared to be animals and creatures that could communicate with spirits of the dead. Black cats have some religious origins as well. They were considered originally to be reincarnated beings with the ability to divine the future, and then during the Middle Ages, they were actually considered to be witches in stealth mode. When they wanted to escape observation, they would turn themselves into black cats and be able to wander around unnoticed. But these smart villagers caught on very quickly and started realizing that black cats were actually witches in disguise. Well, witches, witchcraft have always been a part of the celebration of Halloween. Witches generally believe that they're actually celebrating an ancient religion, even predating Christianity, called Wicca. And the other half of this new age paganistic kind of revival, you got the witches and the warlocks and witchcraft on one side. On the other, you have these nature religions, these pre-Christian nature religions that attempt to return to the worship of Norse and Greek and Celtic gods and goddesses. So you've got two sides of this paganistic religion revival that's so popular today. Then to witches, though, Halloween is a festival of the dead, and it represented, and I'll give a quote here, the end and the beginning of the witch's year. It marks the beginning of the death and destruction associated with winter. At this time, the power of the underworld is unleashed, and spirits are supposedly free to roam around the earth, and it's considered the best time to make contact with spirits. And this is taken from Halloween and Satanism by P. Phillips, J. H. Roby, 1987, page 146. Well, the Apostle Paul had a few things to say about witchcraft, and he said it's one of the acts of a sinful nature, and those who practice it will not inherit the kingdom of God. That's in Galatians 5:16 through 21, Revelation 22:15, and a whole number of other verses. Let's talk then about divination. That's always been a part of the celebration of Samhain and now of Halloween and so forth. So it's been a traditional part of it, and it's the idea of obtaining good fortune and looking into the future, foretelling the future. And Samhain was a time when it was customary for the pagans to use this occult practice of divination. And they would try to determine the weather for the upcoming year and how it would impact their growth of crops, corn, and so forth, and who perhaps in their village, in their community would marry, and who they would marry, and what order, and all these kinds of things would try to be determined by these activities involving divination. The idea behind ducking or duking or bobbing for apples seems to have been that snatching a bite from an apple that was floating in a barrel of water or a bucket of water or horse trough or even hanging from a string, I guess, attached to a rafter or whatever, would be a little bit of good luck, good fortune. And so that was why they tried to do this. Now, also, the unmarried, the idea there was the first to snatch the bite of this apple. If you were unmarried, then you would be the next to get married. So probably it had a long line of rather matronly looking women elbowing and shoving, trying to get in line here to grab the first bite of that apple so that they would be the next one in the village to get married. Well, Samhain was a time then to get rid of weakness, and the villagers would go out to their livestock and slaughter the weakest because they figured they couldn't make it through the tough winters that were in Northern Ireland and Gaul and Britain and so forth. And that sort of morphed into the custom of writing down your weaknesses on a piece of paper and then putting that piece of paper into a bonfire or the ashes of a bonfire, and thus getting rid of your weaknesses that way. That would be pretty cool if that were true, but I don't think it's going to work out too well. Well, there used to be a custom then of also placing a stone in the hot ashes of a bonfire, and then you come back the next morning. If the stone was there, still there, that was a good thing. If it was there without any cracks or anything, that was a good thing. But if it had a crack in it, or if the stone wasn't there, then Katie bar the door, you were in for some pretty bad luck in the near future. Another thing they used to do, well, they used to put also nuts in the ashes also, and if they burned and roasted correctly, that was a good thing. If they exploded, that was a bad thing. Peeling an apple. Throwing the apple peels over your shoulder. Now that was supposed to give you the first initial of your future spouse. I don't know exactly how that worked out. I haven't been able to figure out the relationship between throwing apple peels over your shoulder and finding out the initial of your future spouse, but they believed it anyway. Another thing they used to do is wander around. I don't know why they would do this, but they used to wander around at night on Samhain, go to the churchyard, and see who they could see wandering around, the spirits there. And now, if they saw some of their villager friends and so forth wandering around that churchyard on Samhain, that was supposed to tell them who in the village would die in the upcoming year. Wow. Dear Christian, should we be adopting any of these superstitious, paganistic, occult practices? Can we borrow from these pagan customs and superstitions of ancient people and try to Christianize them? As believers, we're called to test everything, to hold on to that which is good, to avoid every kind of evil. That's 1 Thessalonians 5, 21 and 22. Who can deny that virtually every single symbol of Halloween is evil? Witches, monsters, ogres, vampires, ghosts, ghouls, goblins, demons. I could go on. All of them portray evil. None of them portray good. Christians are to have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. Ephesians 5:11. Is Halloween then just another innocent little holiday that's for the kids, and we old curmudgeon fundamentalists, we should try to lighten up and chill out and not take it so seriously and so forth? And is it really just childish fun? How about vandalism and wanton disregard for property rights on Halloween? You get a lot of increase in property rights. I know that when I was a cop, for a lot of years, 17 years, I started with LAPD, Los Angeles PD in 1975. I wound up getting injured as a police chief in a small town in Washington State. But my point is this, that as a police officer doing street patrol or as a police chief, I noticed an uptick on Halloween of property crime, malicious mischief, vandalism, things that would normally not occur on any other night of the year. Now, is that from God or is that from Satan? God's not the author of those kinds of vandalism and acts of malicious mischief. How about the reports a number of years ago of poison candy and pins and needles and razor blades and apples and other kinds of fruit and so forth? I've even read or heard, and I can't tell you where, about certain hospitals offering their x-ray machines to x-ray children's candy. I don't know if I was a child, I don't think I want candy that had gone through an x-ray machine, but you get the point. This is not from God. These kinds of things that have to be done are originated with Satan himself. God doesn't author these things. Should the church be compromised by accommodating itself to this kind of culture? Do not conform any longer to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Romans 12:2. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? 2 Corinthians 6:14 and 15. When America, and indeed the world, celebrates the festival of Samhain and the powers of darkness by masquerading as evil creatures, or decorating our homes and schools and businesses and churches even with occult symbols, is God's power glorified? No, Satan's power is glorified, folks. The sort of practices celebrated then on Halloween are what defiled the ancient nations. You can see Leviticus 18:24 through 30 for that. The Israelites were warned against such practices when they entered the promised land. When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abomination of those nations. Deuteronomy 18:9. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, spells, casts spells, or who is a medium or a spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. And because of these detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out the nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord your God. The nations you will dispossess, listen to those who practice sorcery or divination. But as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. Deuteronomy 18:10 through 14. Well, folks, let's then take a quick look and find out what is really wrong with Halloween. Halloween does not have even one redeeming virtue, biblically speaking. It's a custom born out of pagan superstition. It's demon-inspired, devil-glorifying. It's an occult festival. It's an evening holy unto evil, death, and divination. The scripture tells us to abstain from all appearance of evil. 1 Thessalonians 5:22. Christian, wake up. This is the night of evil. And those who love the Lord Jesus Christ should have nothing to do with it. We're all accountable, dear Christian, for the choices we make. Ignorance is no excuse. The choice is up to you. Even buying candy and giving out candy to those who come to your door, let alone letting your own children participate in Halloween. But even handing out candy, you become guilty of their evil deeds. Folks, 2 John 10 and 11, where it talks about someone with a false doctrine, a false teacher coming to your door. Not only are you not to invite that person in, but you are not to bid that person Godspeed as you figuratively drop kick him off the front porch door. So, folks, if you do, even handing out candy, you become a part of their evil deeds. You don't have to go out and dress up in a evil-looking costume and sacrifice human beings or get a black cat and sacrifice it and so forth. You don't have to become a direct part of it. If you go out and buy candy and just give that candy away to kids, you are continuing the practice of Halloween. And it is not a practice that born-again, Bible-believing Christians who have been saved by saving faith should be involved in. Think very closely about this, folks, and take this issue to the Lord in prayer. You really need to do this. Well, thanks again, folks, for being with us. We hope that you are going to tune in the future. Maybe the next time we do give a broadcast out here in the next month or two, we will have this new Christian Apologetics Training Center completed. And it's going to be done to the glory of the Lord. We do solicit, not your money, but we do solicit your prayers. That you would keep us in mind and pray that God will bless our activities here, that we will be able to find those in the community who will come in and learn things as I learn things from God's revealed and written word. And so thanks again so much for being with us. You can get any copies of any previous modules that we've done on Roman Catholicism, on Bible prophecy, on so many other subjects, folks. You can write us at Defense of the Faith Ministries, 6601 Karjala, Karjala Road, Aberdeen, Washington 98520. If you have a computer and you have an email account, you can email us with that request at fundamentalist, lowercase fundamentalist, the number 7, at yahoo.com. So thanks again for being with us. We hope to see you in upcoming modules. And keep in contact with us, folks. We'd love to be able to hear from you and respond to your needs. Thanks again for being with us. God bless you all.